Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the PJSTA Live. My name is Brian St. Pierre. I'm a member of the Port Jefferson Station Teachers Association. I'm joined here tonight by Allison McDowell, who is a parent from Philadelphia, and Gia Lee, who is a teacher in New York City. And we're going to be talking tonight about Ed Reform 2.0. And we have Allison here to present on that. So I'm going to let her introduce herself and get right to our presentation.
Okay, well, thanks so much for inviting me out tonight. So just a little bit of background on myself. I'm a parent. I have a daughter who is in high school here in Philadelphia. I've been active in the opt-out movement here in Philadelphia and with United Opt-out for a number of years. And there was sort of a shift in the spring of 2015 testing season where the Philadelphia School District has been sort of a crucible for education reform. We're on our fourth road superintendent. We've been under state control, yada, yada, austerity. And they laid off a bunch of teachers in 2013 and rolled out a school report card system. Meanwhile, our district was really interested in sort of supporting opt-out efforts all of a sudden at that year. So I started looking into what was happening with the opt-out movement, how that segued in with the behavior of our unelected school reform commission and our board superintendents, connected with Emily Talmadge, who is a blogger and a teacher in Maine, and was looking at the ESSA changes and the shifts that were taking place towards embedding assessment, pulling back off of end-of-year testing and embedding assessment into the curriculum through formative assessments. And so that sort of led me down this rabbit hole for the last year and a half of looking into educational technology and where things were headed. So that's sort of how I came to it. I have a presentation that I presented at the Northeast UCOR conference a couple weeks ago, and I was going to share that if that's all right.
Excellent.
Here. All right.
So
that
up, one of the things that when I have seen your presentation, one of the things that always jumps out at me is how, in so many school districts, we're still like battling all of the well-known privatization schemes that sort of came in the first wave of school reform. And at the same time, there are so many things that are sort of being implemented through the back door. And so so I'm excited that you can share this with us and help sort of cast some light on some of those things.
Great, yeah, and like I said, this has sort of been framed as Ed Reform 2.0 or Opt-out 2.0. I know everyone's sort of in the thick of things with the beginning of the testing season starting the last couple of weeks. And, by all means, everyone continue to opt out. I think the opt-out movement has been really wonderful in terms of an organizing opportunity and bringing parents into the conversation and empowering parents to sort of take that stand for their children's education. And so my goal through this presentation is to say, so how can we expand the tools that we've developed in this first phase and apply it to what's coming up ahead? So this is sort of opt-out in the context of big data automated teaching and going beyond the end of year test. And Brian, what you had said, so on the left-hand column, these are all of sort of the key elements of this first phase of education reform. And it really is a shock doctrine type of situation. I mean, these were all put in place to destabilize public education, to defund public education, to push out veteran teachers, to put into place teachers with alternate certification and credentials that would be open to implementing data-driven education. And these
Allison,
are all still real threats.
Can you just share the screen?
Oh, is it not shared? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Wait
no problem.
That's
fine.
Thank you. I thought I had done it. See, I am not as technically savvy as, oh, great. It says no results found. Wait a minute. Desktop? Oh, maybe I didn't hit the start. There we go. Excellent. All right. So I'm so sorry. Okay. So yes. First column is sort of what we're dealing with. Let me go in the presenter view. Vouchers, charters, TFA, all of these elements. Meanwhile, there are a lot of other things that if you have time to pay attention to what the reform community and what those investing in ed tech and privatization are doing next, these are all of these other things on the right-hand column that very few people are talking about. And like, I'm in a situation, I work half time and I have time to follow the money and read all of this. None of it's behind a paywall. And once you learn the language and learn the players, it's very out there. I mean, if you pretend that you're someone in on the industry, this is very much part of the mix of what everyone's talking about that's coming next. So I'm going to go into more detail about learning ecosystems, which is this top element. But just briefly, hybrid blended learning, the teacher is the guide on the side, the mentor. That's very big in the next phase. The move towards embedding assessments into the curriculum, both gamification of education and introducing more augmented and virtual reality simulations, which seems somewhat far out, but the price points are really dropping. So there's a big push and a lot of interest in those markets to push like HoloLens, Oculus Rift, Google Cardboard into classrooms. This is the whole child data collection has come about with the passage of ESSA, and in many respects, like we all appreciate collecting information on, that we should be looking at the whole child. The concerns here are that gathering this data without the intention of providing supports for children or using that data in a careful way are the concern. Additionally, there's a big push nationwide to have flexibility of credits so that more and more credit towards high school graduation can be earned outside of a school building and not under the supervision of a certified teacher. There's a push towards standards-based grading, which you no longer have A through F, but you have whether you're meeting a standard or not meeting a standard. The push for digital badges and online portfolios, so collecting all of that information online. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Also, workforce pathways. Just one second. I went to Seattle and got a cold on the airplane, so apologies on that. No problem. So this is what a learning ecosystem looks like. It doesn't really look like school. It's going to be hard to find a school or a teacher. The ecosystem model, which is this Ed Reform 2.0, really is dependent on largely a cyber-based platform supplemented by community-based learning. And once you turn education into a set of standards, something that you can just collect and that you don't need a lot of subjective grading, you can just demonstrate that you've mastered it or you haven't mastered it. This concept of anytime, any place, anywhere, any pace learning is how they talk about it. So they're saying like, you can just go out into the world and collect competencies for your portfolio and demonstrate that you have skills for your workforce pathway. And this document was prepared by KnowledgeWorks, which is based in Ohio. It was initially funded through Gates money, part of his Small Schools Initiative in the early 2000s. And you can see on the right, this is some of the information that I've pulled out of this, that schools can be self-organized. So all of the Ed Reform 2.0 language is very much around quote unquote personalization. This isn't children learning with other children. It's all suited to the one individual child. That learners and their families create playlists of learning. And again, this playlist concept is really important because a lot of the folks behind this are also the same people who are investing in Netflix and other algorithmic-driven software programs like Reed Hastings. Dreambox is his program, his personalized learning program. And then lastly, it says that the playlist might include public schools. So public schools are not central to the learning ecosystem. That you could just as easily demonstrate you have competencies and standards in other places, either through apps or in place-based learning experiences. And those could be at places like libraries, museums, maker spaces, all sorts of places that wouldn't necessarily have a certified teacher available. So that's an ecosystem. And this is how they envision teachers won't be teachers anymore. They'll have these other types of jobs. And it very much plays into this idea of, precarity and gig economy. Probably most of these jobs are not jobs that necessarily pay a full-time salary or have benefits. These data stewards, pathway designers, competency trackers, pop-up reality producers. It's sort of education as collecting things and entertainment. And really everyone is sort of out on their own, collecting their own thing, but it's not in any way learning in relationship or like in collaboration with other people. And what concerns me as a parent is the idea that, you know, as challenging as it is to navigate the whole school, if you're in a situation where there are different options of schooling for your child, what does that ecosystem look like if all of a sudden this new model, families are being forced to put together 20 or 30 different educational opportunities for their children, maybe multiple children, maybe families for whom English isn't their first language, children that have special needs, learning differences. This whole ecosystem model there's a lot of questions behind it for me. So obviously that's something I don't think will happen immediately, like in the next couple of years. People are still very much holding on to the idea of school as something that you have in your community. So the goal of Ed Reform 2.0 is really to transition people and make digitally based education more of a normal thing, and to claim more and more of the school day as sort of algorithmic driven education under the guise of personalization. And this will come in the form of hybrid learning. Sometimes it's known as blended learning or personalized learning. So districts that are getting one-to-one devices where teachers are not necessarily the ones who are deciding how the devices are used, where students are logging into with unique logins to adaptive curriculum programs. Used to be test prep, increasingly it's becoming the curriculum. Here in Pennsylvania, we have something called Study Island, which was used for test prep for our state end of year tests for years. Now they've come out with a white paper for Pennsylvania stating that they're transitioning to a competency-based learning platform.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, jump in.
Really quick. I gave a really modified version of Allison's presentation in Long Island a couple months ago at a forum organized by the Student Not Scores group, Brian, that you're affiliated with. And when I mentioned some of this stuff, a lot of the teachers in the room identified immediately. They were saying there were programs like iReady,
yes,
that were already being implemented, and that much of their time and resources were feeling pressured to take on these programs to meet certain, goals. And then at the UCORE conference as well, where we met with many teachers from New Jersey and locally, they also said, oh yeah, blended learning is already happening in grades as young as kindergarten. So I just want to say, it is not that far off, and I'm seeing it starting to happen here in New York City.
Right. It's like what I was thinking is a lot of these things to me are already familiar, and they are, Long Island is sort of known as being like the opt-out hotbed, right? Like we've had some very successful opt-out movement on Long Island. My school district this week, we gave the ELA and we had 87% opt-out in my district. And what I'm finding interesting is that even in a place that is sort of a hotbed for opt-out, all this stuff is sort of, it's not even so much on the way as it's already arrived, I think, in a lot of districts. And it's sort of through the back door while everybody has been focused on the high stakes testing issue. And I think part of what this is showing us is the need to be aware on several fronts on how these things make their way into our schools.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because last year I have an open records request in that I haven't gotten to the Philadelphia School District, but they used a lot of our Title I money for Chromebook grants. And the Chromebooks, the grant application actually excerpted language from the Clayton Christensen Institute, which is a main push driver of blended learning and disruptive education. Clayton Christensen, he's a Harvard professor of disruption, and they disrupt healthcare and education. So that the application form for the schools to get their Chromebooks quoted this ed reformer on the application. Of course, very few people were in the know enough to recognize that that's what it was, but there were 2 tracks to get the Chromebook. And one, you could use Chromebooks to do authentic work. My daughter attends a magnet school, and they were applying for Chromebooks to do research papers and creative writing and PowerPoints and things that were very much educator-led and student-led, and used, not overly used at their discretion. But most of our turnaround schools were then required to use these blended learning programs that were very prescriptive, corporate model, adaptive curriculum platforms, which are very limiting and exactly opposite what those kids need to get excited about learning. So there are a lot of issues built in, and I don't want to seem that I'm against all technology, because obviously we're using it right now to share information, and but I think we need to be increasingly aware of what type of technology we're using and who's in charge of it. And this is an industry publication from last year. You can see who's paying for it. Microsoft, Smart, Insight, and Edgenuity. So these are all folks who have a vested financial interest in having lots of devices and software run the education programs. Our chief academic support officer was part of putting this together. There are about superintendents from 20 other parts of the country. So this is nationwide. I had just pulled it for Philadelphia for a presentation I had done. And again, we are not about not allowing students to have access to be empowered to use technology. But I think ultimately we need to, this quote here is from that report. And I think it is an insight into the end game of blended learning. Sorry for the technical difficulty. All right, so this is a follow-up. This is from the best practices of the Making Blended Work report. And so even though they're going to pitch parents and teachers that this is all about getting kids ready for the high-tech future, increasingly the digital online blended learning program is about reducing access to human teachers. So this is one of the best practices from that report. Again, it's industry-created report. This North Carolina school district, Cabarrus County, decided in 2014 that they would identify their best, quote unquote, best teachers in high school and middle school students that they taught, but only have them teach students in person half the time, and then pay the teachers more to get the same results on those kids, meaning test results. So increasingly, when the students are not with their human teacher, they're doing blended learning on devices, either individually or within groups of peers. And for me, that just doesn't seem like what you would want out of education. That you would want to cut the amount of time your child had with a human teacher in half, just to get test scores. So the learning ecosystem model seems a little out there. It seems a little improbable. How could this happen? Is this just a fringy idea? I think it's important to understand behind this transition, this sort of paradigm shift of school as a place that you go to in your community with other kids and teachers, and having it change into something fundamentally different, which is this decentralized learning ecosystem where you're picking up skills for your electronic portfolio, is being driven by very powerful forces. And this is a slide from Vincent Mosco. He's written a book about big data and the cloud. And it identifies the most valuable firms in the world, including Alphabet, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook, all of whom have very specific financial investments in this playlist digital type of education that is sort of before us at the moment. So there are a number of different interests beyond Silicon Valley. Department of Defense has underwritten a lot of this work. I mean, they've been working on it for years, ever since, through the 50s, on computer-based learning and human-computer systems. That's being done through DARPA and the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative. The research universities have a hand in this as well. So Carnegie Mellon, MIT, University of Florida, University of Michigan, University of Southern California, like many, many universities, University of Washington, in on all of this. The telecommunications companies, again, very powerful interests, as we know from this week. Philadelphia is home to Comcast, and they're building their second giant skyscraper, looking to sort of push all of our education through their broadband channels. Foundations are very powerful, and I know Bill Gates gets a lot of play, but he provides cover for a lot of other folks who are involved in this, namely Carnegie, MacArthur, Ford Foundation, Hewlett-Packard, Nellie Mae, many, many foundations that are pouring money into blended learning right now. The cultural institutions, so museums, libraries, maker spaces, they're all really set up to grow in this new badging type of setup. They're going to be issuing those competencies, so they're looking the other way. All of these skills are aligned to workforce interests, so the Chambers of Commerce, United Way, all of those folks are very interested. And then I think underpinning all of this, in terms of why this is happening beyond the Silicon Valley interests, are global finance. So that's pay for success.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just checking this time. 1 second, let me just. Sorry, a little tickle in the throat. Okay. Oh. New Profit. So New Profit brought something called social impact bonds to the United States. Sorry. Social impact bonds started in the UK. The Harvard Business Review says they're going to be the new venture capital, 2013, that's what they said. So they were brought in, and the idea is that when you no longer have public funding for public programs, opportunities for private financial interests to invest in public programs. And they incentivize programs that quote unquote work. So successful programs that have very specific measures, evidence-based programs. So increasingly, these are programs that would be driven by very specific data-driven results. And what's very interesting is that New Profit, which is based out of Boston, is currently investing in all sorts of educational technology platforms and blended learning platforms. They have a whole program called Reinventing Public Education, different portfolios. These social impact bonds depend on third parties to evaluate their success. And so that's why, like, third-party lawyers for Goldman Sachs are not going to be looking through authentic portfolios of student work. They need something that's very metric-oriented. And so I think a lot of the pay for success elements are driving standards-based learning and data-driven education that lacks human contact. Increasingly, Gates is also funding all of these things too. So it's not just the platforms, but it's the charter school operators and the alternative teaching programs that are going to be open to running this sort of data-driven education. Automation of education, intelligent tutoring systems, they're called learning management systems, to get your data uploaded to these learning record stores or e-portfolios. These have been in development since the 50s, but they're very sophisticated now. Sorry, this is a report from 2014, U.S. Army Research Lab. Sorry, guys. And they're developing tutoring systems to manage people's behavior and emotions. You look at the table of contents, they're creating programs that train students, children to be gritty and to adapt to their negative emotions. And I know a lot of teachers out there, I don't know if it's like in Pennsylvania, you have to do an online class to certify that you can give the standardized tests at the end of the year, these end of year tests, to do an online program. And they're horrible. Everyone hates them. And I think we all know that students hate these online programs, but instead of saying we're not going to do them, instead they build programs that will remediate you while you're having negative emotions about them. This slide references Carnegie Learning. Again, that's an offshoot of Carnegie Mellon University. This middle school is part of the intelligent tutoring system, personalized learning. And I just testified against an expanded contract for professional development with Carnegie Learning in Philadelphia. So this stuff is happening. It's already in our schools. Increasingly, students are not having as much time with human teachers. And there's really some strange things. They seem very improbable, but these are things that are seriously under development. Articulab, again, a Carnegie Mellon program, they say that children learn well with peers, and we would say yes, right? You know, children do learn well with other children. Well, they're creating life-size screen cartoon peers that children interact with on the screen. This being templated outside of Pittsburgh. In Texas, there's a program called Reasoning Mind. It's a chatbot math teacher, and this is for young elementary school age children, and kids were getting really attached to these like messaging with their chatbots. And then even within a human component, TutorMate is a program. I have a friend teaches in Michigan. This person's class was removed from the teacher's classroom during a school day to go to a computer lab to do Skype interactive tutoring sessions with corporate volunteers. So, and this isn't an after-school program. These are children who are interacting on a screen with a corporate volunteer who, instead of being with their teachers. So the teachers are being more and more pulled out of the equation. Are we still good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So credit flexibility, increasingly not about having school in school. You can hack your high school. This is Hackable High School. This is out of Ohio. If a student comes up with a student learning contract that meets a standard, they can go get that knowledge anywhere in their community. And then the school is required to do the paperwork on the student learning contract and monitor it, and then forego the funding that the student would have had they been in class. So not only is it not funded, the schools are losing. So the examples they were giving is like, so-and-so can do Khan Academy over the summer and get their math credit. Somebody can do a summer improv class at a local community theater and get their school credit. New Hampshire is far out ahead on this. You can get school credit for travel, for after-school work programs, for a lot of different things, which within some small limitations, that might be acceptable for a limited number of elective credits, but there's no limit in Ohio on what that looks like. So they're saying, like, we should just trust kids to go out and do whatever they want in the world and get school credit. But obviously that's very problematic for the existence of schools, particularly when you're pulling funding out of schools while the kids are doing those. So increasingly, I think schools are profit centers, which is, you know, it's a heightening of where we have been with the charter situation. Data has value, and I think increasingly we're looking at schools as being data factories and children as producers of data. As much as our education is going online, there's definitely a component of surveillance there. You know, you're watching the presentation on a camera. All of this online interface is being monitored and gathered. You know, we don't always have control over how things are used. In addition to wanting to know academic data and collect that data, ESSA has sort of thrown open the door to collecting a lot more data about students, social emotional learning, which again, we value education, but collecting microdata on a daily basis is problematic. And understand that data is used going forward and what the implications might be for children on the aggregation of that data is an issue. Are you guys still there?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a map of character traits from something called Red Critter. There's two applications. One is, and there's also a corporate side. It's a behavior management chart, and teachers can zing children virtual currency and credits. The kids like wear biometric monitoring badges, and the teachers use their phone. I mean, it's a really behaviorist approach, but we end up with these types of visualizations of a kid who is evidently very gritty but not very coachable. Another way of pulling out behavioral data. And kids love games. I mean, and who doesn't like a fun game, right? But I think we need to be aware of what information is. Some of these games are pulling things like leadership skills, system thinking, embedding career information into that. So again, we have to understand the scope of data collection is growing. And moving forward, for me, what I value about public education is that to learn together with a human teacher, with other children in a school community. Time interaction and being in a real space together is important. And as we end up giving more of our day to these online learning systems and learning by algorithms, essentially it's like allowing cyber charter schools to colonize your school. And I've equated it a little bit to a cicada killer, which is this wasp that we have in Pennsylvania that captures cicadas and paralyzes them and buries them underground and incubates their eggs on them. Is that sort of, you know, where the neighborhood schools are the cicadas, the cicadas, and we're incubating this digital learning platform. We don't realize we're being charterized from within. And the issue of local control is real, because it might start out with 90 minutes a week of iReady, but the next year teacher cuts and other things happen, and maybe you lose 20% of your school day to these online programs, 30. At what point is your school no longer your school? And what does it mean for children who can only learn what they're allowed to learn based on what the algorithm tells them and what their best behavior is? There's some real issues. Close. Eric Schmidt has this quote about data being the new oil, so powerful nation states will fight over it. And again, in Philadelphia, we've had terrible education cuts to our budgets, but a year or so ago, they gave all of our teachers a data-driven education book, which nobody wanted. But data isn't neutral. It has value to folks, and our kids are creating this value. It can be used to control people, to maintain power balances, and to modify how kids and teachers act. And I think being collected, that we're just not even aware of how much is being gathered and what it's ultimately being used for. I will just sort of reiterate, Kathy O'Neill is amazing. She's a mathematician, former quant, has friends who are a New York City principal, and has written a book called Weapons of Math Destruction, and looking at the implications of algorithms on justice, not just in education, but in other areas. So again, as in the opt-out season, I want to say opt out, but we need to start expanding the conversation. You know, I don't know how long end-of-year tests are going to be central to this process, but I think increasingly the embedded assessment and required online learning systems, it's going to be ramping up. So issues of not career surveys, Naviance, the PSAT incursion into middle schools, online behavior management, the class dojos, the class crafts. You have Red Critter in your school district. Adaptive learning management systems. And again, when people ask me about technology, my line is, I don't want a system that has to learn my child to work properly. If my child has to put in a unique identifier for that system to recognize my child and know how to function, for me, I'm not comfortable with that. I would rather that decision on what my child learns and has access to lie with the teacher, the human teacher, not the algorithm. Google Apps for Education, again, I know, and you know, I have a Gmail account, so I will admit that it's incredibly valuable, and it's free, and it's helpful and seamless, but there are issues around that. And in Philadelphia, all of our student email addresses they're managed by Google, and the accounts are their student ID numbers. So, you know, as soon as the student logs in with the Chromebook with their student ID number, all of that information is tracked, and it's very questionable how that applies under FERPA and who has access to that. I've actually opted my daughter out of Google Apps for Education. She doesn't use her school district issued email, and they figured out a way around it. Not many people do, but we have done that. Increasingly looking at issues of student data privacy. Maryland, it didn't make it through, but there have been increasingly discussions around screen time limits, especially as these the one-to-one device programs are pushed down all the way into kindergarten. There are serious visual and health implications and fine motor skills for kids using the devices. And then again, I think these kids are in our care. And as data is being pulled, ultimately know how it's all going to be used. Slide. I think people have found very helpful. And it's important to know that we're fighting a lot of propaganda around technology. The MacArthur Foundation has invested $500,000 over 10 years to a company called Frameworks to essentially do focus group studies, various social science research to understand where the public is with regard to understanding digital education. And they know where they want us to be. And so they've done the research and they say, this is how we nudge people to where we want them. You just incrementally say these things. This is the messaging. This is how we stay on message. Don't ever say these things. Always say these things. And they've got a very structured plan of how to go about this. And so what I'm trying to do is blow that up a little bit and sort of reframe and question some of the language that they're using and insert alternate language that in my mind could be equally applicable. So where things that are innovative, perhaps they're untested. Where they're talking about student-centered, this image is from a rocket ship school. They would call that student-centered. Everybody's getting a personalized experience. It's very isolating. Adaptive learning. Oh, it adapts to me, but it keeps you on the path that they allow you to be on. This blended learning, they'll pitch it as having great access to tech. Really, it's limiting your access to your human teacher. Formative assessments, they're great. They're not nearly as stressful as an end of the year test. You won't hardly even know you're being tested. Surveillance type of mechanism. You don't know. So you're always under, it's the panopticon aspect. Gamification, it's really fun, but these games are intentionally designed to shape how you interact with them. And that the one-to-one devices are data gathering platforms. And for me, I have some other slides that talk about, Orwell, that essentially in many respects, we're telescreens. We are interacting with devices, but they're watching us as much as we're watching them. So anyway, I guess my question sort of is how can we adapt strategies that have been very successful in the end of year opt-out to preserving education as inherently human activity, where people in the human relationship, students are empowered to use technology and that technology does not profile or limit them. So that's kind of it. And I have a blog, it's called Wrench in the Gears. So that's the bottom line.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Allison.
So there's a lot to unpack here. And there is, and there's a lot, certainly if, I think this will be new to a lot of people, and there's a lot to sort of digest and take in. But some of the big themes that I'm seeing are sort of a lack of human contact, decreased contact with not just other teachers, but in some cases with just people in general for students, a lot more screen time, and an insane amount of data collected by for-profit corporations that we don't really know what is happening with it. But so that's like the initial takeaway. But then I guess my first question would be this. So as a teacher, I have seen, and you mentioned this with your daughter and her Chromebook, I have seen some ways that some of the technology can be used in an effective way to in authentic type learning situations. So my first question would be this: how, as whether it's as teachers or as parents, how do we evaluate these things that we see coming into the classrooms of our schools? How would you recommend as we see different things entering, we start to unpack them in terms of, what are the motivations behind these?
Well, some of it is around budgeting. And so that's, in Philadelphia, so we're austerity budgeting and we keep losing teachers. And they'll say, well, we don't have enough money for a staff person, but we have a smart board and we'll buy you a subscription to an online class. So, I mean, at a very fundamental level, even beyond the adaptive systems. And they're pushing AP classes that way too, which is, I mean, for anyone who understands a real meaningful AP, like I had AP classes, that's not appropriate. So, I mean, for me, I think it's the adaptive part, and it's the amount of time spent. And then I question additionally for young children, what is this what are the implications for young children in these one-to-one devices? And this is what I'm seeing. I have friends who have elementary school age children, Baltimore County particularly. The kids are really stressed. They're spending like 6 hours a day on devices. So I have a blog post that has questions that parents should ask about digital curriculum. And it asks some of the, like, how much time? What is it replacing? What data is collected? How much of the budget is being used on this? I'm concerned that some of these technology purchases may end up being passed, may create the financial conditions that will ultimately lead to schools being closed down. And I was just in Seattle and hearing that there was a school district that for all intents and purposes was thought up as being a very financially well-off school district that was doing mid-year furloughs because they ran out of money. And I think we're going to be seeing this more and more in other places. So who gets to decide when the technology is used? And is it adaptive? I think I kind of have a problem with the adaptive stuff versus the creative, but that's just me. But you guys are educators, so you have a different view.
I think, just to piggyback off of what Allison is saying, we're already starting to have a conversation around the kinds of schools our children deserve, and our communities deserve. And when we start to have that conversation, we become clear about the importance of human contact, right? And that the way that children's brains learn and the way that people learn is through collaboration. It's through, learning is actually, when they found, did some brain studies through cognitive research, found that learning is actually an emotional behavior, right? You don't really learn anything unless you've become somehow emotionally connected to it. And this idea that learning happens in a really cold, isolated way through, algorithms and, whatnot, and that it's data to be collected is going back to this notion of filling a vessel. And then that's not where I think if we try to have these conversations more and more, we get to that place and it becomes clear that when these kinds of programs or policies are introduced into our schools, we say, that's not what we value, and therefore we're not going to adopt these things. But we do see the tensions that Allison's talking about. Our budget, our New York State budget, is supposed to be voted on tomorrow, right? And under Governor Cuomo's executive budget proposal, he wants to lift the charter cap and make, like New York City responsible for rent of all charter schools, facilities, you name it, up and down. It's just opening up the floodgates to whatever innovations, right, are just waiting like vultures at the door, at the gate. But are we prepared to say, no, that's not where we want our tax dollars? Are we there yet? And I think that in different parts of the state we are, and there are, I can say the same for New York City. There are schools, and maybe districts, but as a whole, I don't know that we're collectively there, and we have to build towards that. So that's about organizing.
Right, and I think that's that question you just posed of are we there yet is I think a really important one, and it sort of, and it goes along with what I just asked Allison of how do we, I think we have some communities and we have some maybe school districts in the state and within the New York City where there's people who are ready to hear this or who are receptive to it. But one of my real major takeaways is that so much of this is so deeply embedded, and so much of it is centered around things we have been, told for a long time are exciting and innovative and engaging to students and help them learn. That it it seems like a monumental task, and it seems like a challenge in terms of how we're going to get communities there. But ultimately, Gia, I think it does come down to what you said is just our ability to organize within our communities. And so and I know this is something we've talked about, but what I'm wondering is what types of and Allison, you did a really good job on one of the slides. You talked about the some of the language that they use, because they do a very good job at sort of co-opting language. And I know, Gia, we've talked about ways that they are sometimes able to get certain personalities or certain institutions that have maybe been trustworthy, within school communities before, and co-opt them too. But I'm wondering, what are for somebody sort of new to this game, as a teacher, as a parent, even as a student, what are some of those what are some of the indicators that this is happening in our schools, and what are some of the things that we need to look out for?
So standards-based grading, I mean, that's something that's often an early transition. Blended learning, I know that the iReady platforms, the Study Island, increasingly those are, I think, going to go beyond benchmark interim testing and become more full-on curriculum. So I think keeping a careful eye out on those platforms, those testing platforms, and trying to figure out ways of opting out of that level. I mean, in Pennsylvania, people could opt out of the end of the year test, but the districts were very loath to let them opt out of the benchmark testing. And friends and I who felt like we saw where things were going, we understood why they didn't want that, because they didn't want to set a precedent that you could opt out of the online learning. I would be mindful about credit flexibility. Again, it's not just the digital, so it's the two pieces. The digital is a big piece because that's what allows them to really streamline costs and get rid of human teachers and make their money. But what they will pitch to parents is the project-based learning and hands-on learning and maker spaces and lots of things that may be happening in out-of-school time learning. And that's the challenge, because those are all fun things. But we've created a situation where all the fun stuff doesn't happen in school anymore. We don't fund drama in school, but you can do the cool after-school drama, program with a community partner. There's a maker space in the public library, but you don't have school libraries anymore. Many of those things are being, and that may not be the case on Long Island, but in Philadelphia, they're stripping everything out, so school just becomes sort of a test factory, a place you don't want to be. So that when they die, when schools die, people are like, well, I never really, I've hated school for a long time, and it's okay. I like these other spaces better. So I think if you're hearing things about badging, I know they use that a lot with professional development for teachers. They're doing a lot of getting teachers used to badging and getting micro-credentials for your professional development. That's a big part of the reform movement, is you guys getting your badges. But allowing community-based groups to issue badges for summer programs, which is hard, because who wants to be against a cool summer program or after-school program? But I think increasingly it's about giving people the information and saying, this is where we think this is headed. How can we make sure this doesn't happen?
Right. It's, that whole sort of outside of school, choose your pathway sort of aspect you were just talking about. It reminds me, Betsy DeVos actually was quoted today talking about that schools should be like choosing between Uber, Lyft, and a taxi. And it's, I mean, that's coming right out of her mouth. And that's very much, it's almost like making school as we know it with relationships and learning from your interactions with people. It's almost making that, like an option that you can turn down. And And so, it was
I would
interesting.
think in Pennsylvania, just one other thing that's happening at the high school level. So I have a friend who, her son is enrolled in a district outside in suburban Philadelphia, and it's an INACOL district. So everyone should know INACOL is the International Association of K-12 Online Learning. INACOL, look it up. They were probably writing the ESSA. And so they have a road superintendent, former military. It's an INACOL test bed. And what they did in their high school was they created a cyber commons. So they took out bonds, they spent all this money. Now the school district has no money. They build a cyber commons so that kids can take online classes during the day in their high school in just sort of like this open space with a coffee shop and beanbags. And the situation was, you can take an online class and its modules, and you get a pretest for each module. And if you pass the pretest at 70%, you can go on to the next one. So the students, rather than taking a challenging like ELA class, literature class, and reading real books, can instead do an online class in school, like in beanbag chairs, in the cyber commons, and just quickly go through. And plus, I mean, there's not a ton of adults, so who knows like how authentic the learning process is that they're doing these pre-tests, like, on beanbags. The child finished the whole year of English in 6 weeks. But there was no real work. There was no real writing. There was no real books read. But they got the credit for that.
Right.
So anyway, I'm just saying, like, this is the trend, and this may look, really fancy, like, hey, we're building this cool cyber common space, but the outcome is really degraded education. If you can
Yeah, and INACOL, which Allison put me onto, is funded by the Gates Foundation and the Walton family, and all of these folks that we know are pushing for a generation, basically, of children who are future workers, who are not going to be critical thinkers, who don't want to unionize or fight for working conditions. And it is, our teachers union is basically what stands in the way of their big goal. And it's jackhammer after jackhammer. But I think one thing that we need to also highlight is our union leadership at the AFT level and at the state leadership level sit on committees with these people and negotiate. And I don't understand why, or maybe they are doing their own research on, like following the money, but it's, again, the same thing as, following the motive with Common Core and High-6 testing and charterization, something they negotiated along with for so long, and now they're just coming around to saying, yeah, it's a bad thing. But we're saying this is part of it, and they are, once again, sitting at the table with these folks. So I think that, PJSTA being a leader, in my mind, in New York State, bringing this kind of presentation on is key and integral to growing our knowledge.
Well, and I think I've often kind of thought that part of the reason why these corporations and these the reform groups, one of the reasons they often will bring the union leaderships into the fold is because it helps sort of keep the teachers in line. It helps sort of this, because as a rank and file teacher, there's a lot of our membership who would believe, well, if this has my union's blessing, it must be okay, right? And so I think in a lot of ways it's and we've heard before, whether it's the AFT or NYSA taking Gates money to basically go along with things, and essentially the job of the union in those situations is to basically keep the rank and file teacher, quiet, and keep them sort of with their head buried in the sand. And I think that is, more than anything else for teachers, that's that's a reason to look at your union leadership and to look at what's going on within your unions. And I think the lesson being that as rank and file members, as teachers, as dues paying members, it is, we don't have the luxury of sitting back and assuming that our leadership is always doing the right thing, that we have to be engaged, we have to be asking questions. And when we see our unions moving us in directions that aren't okay, we have a responsibility to take action within our unions as well. So I think that's a really good point you brought up, because the only way that we will change our unions, I know for me, speaking at the state and national level, and Gia, for you, I know at the local level also, the only way we change our unions from being complicit with this sort of thing is through organizing at the membership level, at the rank and file level, and changing it from the bottom up. So thank you for bringing up that point. So we're going to wrap this up in just a minute. Is either one of you have any last couple comments? Okay. All right, Allison, did you want to say something more?
No, I just, you had said that it's challenging to push back, the narrative. And what I would say is, I think that there's a lot of power in just asking some questions. Right now, everyone's just going along. And you don't have to, I'm not telling everyone that they all have to opt out of Google Apps or Educate. I know that is very challenging. But even if we had people at school board meetings to start saying, oh, how much are we spending on this? How do the teachers feel about it? How much time are the kids spending, and what would we do otherwise if we didn't have this? And just slowing the process down, I think it could go a long way. And I really do think that connecting with the parent community, because what's going to save us is communities valuing human teachers. I mean, that's ultimately, it's going to distill down to people caring enough that their kids be taught with human teachers. And we need to build those relationships and to make that time. And I think a lot of progress has been made within the opt-out around making those connections, and they just need to grow.
Right.
Can I add also that, last night I spoke at our local Community Education Council district's monthly meeting on, testing and opt-out, alongside folks who are talking about the state budget from the Alliance for Quality Education, and also somebody from the New York City Budget Office. And, I have to say that the folks who are fighting for fiscal equity, they need to know this information too. We need to be connecting with all of our local, organizations that are fighting around these issues. They're all connected. And to find those connections to build a broader base, I think we'll find a way. There's got to be legalities even
Right.
that are being infringed on. And the more we connect, and also a main takeaway from the audience yesterday was that, we don't know any of this stuff. The parents, the students, the teachers, the administrators, didn't know half of what was being explained about what our fundamental rights are and what the laws are in terms of what a sound and basic education is. Those things are being violated left and right, and people don't even know. So knowing our rights, connecting around how to fight and organize, I think informing ourselves of what the motives are behind these policies, I think we need to come to a common knowledge and connect in that way.
Excellent. Thanks, Gia. So I'm just going to close by plugging an event. We're going to have Allison's nice enough. She's going to come visit us out on Long Island on Thursday, June 1st. There will be more details on that in the coming days on Students Not Scores website, which is studentsnotscoresny.org. So be sure to go there for more information. And I know we're excited to have her come out and speak to us in person in June. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.